One of the crucial problems to overcome is that of the information deficit. We need more transparency in the public interest so that we can have better discussions about what proper rules are around technology. And right now, there's a lot of guessing, and there's a huge dependency on the framing and the information that the tech companies are willing to share with us at a moment that is a good moment for them.
Hey there, welcome to the AI Sidekick, the show designed to help you banish your AI anxiety. I'm your host, Ryan Heath, from Robin AI.
Welcome to the AI Sidekick. Today, I'm joined by Marietje Schaake, who is a leading voice in the fight for responsible AI governance. Now, Marietje has worn many hats, and I'm going to embarrass her by naming a lot of them right now, but it's important that you understand just how special it is that she's joining us today. She's a former member of the European Parliament, a young global leader at the World Economic Forum, and president of the Cyber Peace Institute. She's now a fellow at Stanford's Cyber Policy Center and at Stanford's Institute for Human-Centered AI. Marietje is also a columnist at the Financial Times and author of The Tech Coup, a book that takes a hard look at how Silicon Valley's growing influence is reshaping democracy and the global economy. And she's got a role in implementing the EU AI Act. So hand on heart, I can say you, Marietje, are one of the smartest and most articulate people I know. So welcome to the AI Sidekick.
Well, thanks, Ryan. You did manage to embarrass me, so good thing this is audio only.
Excellent. Ticking it off. Okay, let's get into the questions. It is a wild time here in the United States, from Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency through to this wild west of AI foundation model creators scraping the entire internet to build their allegedly bigger and better products. Now, you're a lifelong capitalist and you've got a great BS detector. How should companies be thinking about efficiency and, ethical and legal risks when it comes to AI?
So I don't know if I would call myself a capitalist, but I think that even the most staunch believers in the capitalist system would agree that rules are necessary to keep the game fair. For example, competition and antitrust rules were fairly uncontroversial until recently. But with AI, we are still in the phase of rules taking shape and a big debate happening, not so much about whether governance is necessary, because I think there's broad agreement around the world that AI presents such risks that there need to be mitigating measures put in place to build trust, but also to avoid some of the worst outcomes or spillovers in society. But there is not agreement yet about what those rules should look like. And certainly the US now choosing a deregulatory agenda means we can't really count on US leadership, even if the biggest AI companies are right there. But if you look at the rest of the world, I think there's been an initial very strong focus on national security, with the AI safety institutes being stood up, the G7 getting involved and thinking about safety in particular. And in some ways, I think it makes sense because for states, national security and safety are top priorities, clear constitutional commitments. But if you look at the practice of how AI is used right now and other risks that are coming from the fact that there are biases and discrimination, or that disinformation and targeting audiences can be assisted by generative AI, or new ways of fraud are being developed, we may have to ask ourselves whether the singular focus on safety is not too narrow and also misses some of the broader issues that are already problematic about the use of AI and that also need tackling.
And what are some of those issues that are at top of your mind? If you're in Washington, they're obviously freaking out about China's development of AI, but it strikes me that China also wants and needs governance of AI. So I'm not really sure why we over-rotate on that.
Well, I think it's a very political dynamic in Washington that was one of the few topics that could bring Republicans and Democrats together. And so there's going to be traction around the one topic that causes bipartisan collaboration, whereas other topics are just not that. And there's a big fueling of this narrative of, standing up against China, competition with China coming from industry. Now, that's not to say that there is nothing to be concerned about. I think we have, real reasons to look carefully at what a authoritarian driven use of AI and its governance means. But I think that the rhetoric around the role of China in the US is sometimes almost like a caricature, but because it works so well for so many people, it continues. So that I think that's the reason why we focus so much or hear so much focus on China. There, of course, there are a lot of rules that remind us that the state can assert itself if it wants to. But in China, technology, including AI, has been made an instrument of state power and influence much earlier on. So the sort of reckoning that we see now in the democratic Western world, the idea that, if the Trump administration wants to really instrumentalize its tech companies for political and state power, it can, is a sort of acceptance of the reality that the Chinese Communist Party has had much earlier. And I think where Europe is lagging behind, because in Europe, the main driver is obviously the single market, making sure that there's harmonized rules between all the member states. It's a protection of fundamental rights according to the charter. But then there's a huge hole in the way the EU is organized that does not allow governance over national security topics, because that's a national competence. And so while the US and China are very much driven by strategic considerations in their prioritizing of how to invest in AI, how to regulate AI, the EU has a number of areas well developed and then underdeveloped in other areas. And that, I think, just puts the EU on a different footing compared to China and the US.
Yeah. I mean, when you say it like that, it actually makes me think they're almost having two different conversations, two important conversations, but kind of pretending it's the same conversation and it's really not. And that brings to my mind this idea that, we have both worked in Brussels, in and around the EU. And I used to get driven mad by the idea that Americans thought everything that went on in the EU about tech was about trying to take down American companies. Given that and these sort of two different conversations, is there a way to translate that European thinking and approach to regulation into American values of freedom and capitalism and all of that?
Yes, I would think so. And I agree that the idea that regulation in the EU is driven by seeking a hammer to clobber the American tech companies with is crazy. The main driver, again, is to make sure there are harmonized rules. But, when you look at a case like the General Data Protection Regulation, arguably one of the most prominent pieces of EU regulation, those data protection rules also bind governments. So the idea is also governments need to be kept in check in the way that they use personal data. So in no way is it just targeting companies. But I'm always struck by all the talk about innovation and the freedom to do business and, competition in the US, which, none of those will happen fairly or successfully without minimum guardrails. And the true resistance from mostly Silicon Valley tech companies to any form of regulation, I think, is very strange, because basically what they're saying is that any kind of rules would get in the way of innovation and are therefore unfair. This is a narrative that's very much back in vogue with the Trump administration now in office. Deregulatory agenda, rules would make it harder to innovate. Listen to what J.D. Vance says, for example. Also accusing Europe of wanting to hinder innovation with rules. And I think it's important not to just look at the function of rules through the lens of innovation, but other issues that are important. We touched on protecting national security. We touched on needing to make sure that there is a trade-off between different interests, such as protection of fundamental rights and freedoms, and obligations. So, another trap besides the sort of innovation trap that I see is the speech trap, where in the US it's very popular to talk about whatever issues and challenges exist around social media only through the lens of speech. But of course, there's more. There's the question of access to information. There's the question of the impact on the spread of information on, for example, public health, public safety. There's the impact of needing to protect minorities from discrimination, but also from being targeted with hate speech, for example. And so I think broadening the lens of what is at stake and why rules might have to be in place is helpful to kind of take us out of that sort of tunnel that tends to have a dead end, which is, the innovation frame and the speech frame. There are just many more responsibilities that states have to make sure that there's fairness between different actors and that the interests of different groups in society are met.
And that brings me right back to your book, The Tech Coup. And one of the arguments you make there is that tech companies increasingly have been taking on state-like powers, but without the corresponding accountability. So, if a government was spewing the sort of misinformation that occurs on many of these platforms, or the inaccurate information that might be spewed out from various AI products, there would be real serious problems. People might be thrown out of office, or there would be major lawsuits, and that is not always the case when it comes to the tech companies. What's the way out of that, and what would you say to people who actually trust the tech companies more, and they think it's the government that's the problem?
So I think it's good to be suspicious about outsized power of any actor, whether it's government or companies or, philanthropists for that matter. So having guardrails and checks and balances on any kind of power, I think, is healthy. But somehow that sort of normal practice, look at cars or, food and beverages or pharmaceuticals or aviation, having some standards that apply to everyone in order to make consumption or use of services safe is actually unquestioned, I would say, across society. But with regard to tech, it's somehow challenged as a principle. And so I think there should not be an expectation that these companies can only succeed in an environment free from regulation. And that there are good reasons to have minimum standards that apply to everyone. I mean, some companies may be willing. In the AI space, there are definitely companies that are, leaning into having safety tests and other assessments of their models, because they also understand that if no one trusts the model, then it's going to be harder for them in the long run to be a successful company. But there are also companies that are dragging their feet, that are not interested in taking that proactive approach. And so having rules is also important to keep the playing field fair for everyone, that we can't just sort of believe in the good promises of CEOs. I think the recent months have shown how volatile those promises are anyway. But that it's just clear what the expectations are, and that in and of itself can also actually help the ease of doing business because it's predictable.
Yeah. And if we think about your sort of involvement at Stanford, when I think of Stanford, I think that's like the literal intersection of innovation and regulation, because you're thinking in a different way to someone who is building a company, but you're thinking with all the people building the companies, and you go and grab your coffee next to the people building the companies. What does that feel like? Does it give you a new sense of what democratic institutions are most at risk, or where there's vulnerability, and now that you see all of that startup and scale up culture up close in Stanford?
I think it's incredibly helpful to see it up close, because only when you spend time in Silicon Valley, and of course we teach the next generation of people who are going to work in companies and perhaps start them as well. But only when you walk around, between VCs and founders, do you appreciate how much trust there still is in technology being the solution to all the problems. So this sort of techno-utopianism, as some people call it, technology can really create better societies, no matter what. And of course, my angle is a different one. First of all, technology and innovation, again, are not the only objective that governments have to reconcile. They have to think about many more goals in society, and sometimes they're conflicting. In fact, almost always is the question about, more spending on healthcare, less spending on defense, or more on defense and less on education. I mean, you can only design your budget, within the limits that you have, and have different mandates for politicians catering to different constituencies. So you have to really see the bigger picture in which technology fits. And so I think that the role that technology has come to play in our societies has become too large, too much leaning on what the tech companies want, what's good for their shareholders, which is not automatically good for society. So I don't buy into this techno-utopianism. And I actually think that governments have been blindsided, and universities have also been blindsided, because so much information about AI, information about, algorithmic amplification on the part of social media companies, core details about how the business models of tech companies impact our society are not transparent, are not accessible, cannot be scrutinized, cannot be researched, whether we're thinking about academic researchers or journalists or parliamentarians. And so one of the crucial problems to overcome is that of the information deficit. We need more transparency in the public interest so that we can have better discussions about what proper rules are around technology. And right now, there's a lot of guessing, and there's a huge dependency on the framing and the information that the tech companies are willing to share with us at a moment that is a good moment for them.
Yeah. And if we sort of assume for a second, and I think we can, that there has been quite a bit of success in making those arguments. I think there are a lot of people out there who want to be involved in tech, but they understand, for example, in AI, that the models are only as good as the data that they're trained on, and that there can be problems with the outputs, that the AI isn't perfect. But then also they've got to sort of get a business up and running, and they can't spend all their money sort of following their ethical conscience, let's say. So do you have any advice for those people that have these twin ideas in their head? Like, I have to have a workable business model, and I don't want to sort of blow up the world at the same time. How do you go about balancing those two things?
So when I talk to people in AI companies that are dealing with trust and safety or, risk mitigation, a lot of them talk about the moment when a model or a new application goes from the research phase to society or the market, right? When it's pushed out into the public as a critical moment of scrutiny. And I think it's a very good moment to focus on, because of course innovation is key, and companies may well, be working very hard to get to that next, level of sophistication or capability of their models. But there are a couple of unique qualities to AI that means that, having a little bit more time between the research and the putting out into the public are actually very beneficial if you want to avoid unintended consequences. Because one, AI models are unpredictable. So even the people who develop them cannot guarantee how the outcomes will look, what the models will behave like. And so you have to assume that there are going to be surprises. And some of those might be helpful. Some of those might be very harmful. So testing the models in a more, restricted environment in the interest of trying to prevent harm to society can actually lead to a lot of beneficial insights. Another aspect of AI is, of course, that it's highly individualized. And so the way that we tend to regulate other products doesn't work, because everybody has a different experience. It's not like you can have, the full batch of a food or a certain car, and that if there's a mistake that okay, well, this batch we have to revoke, bring back, and it doesn't matter who bought it. Whereas with AI, the models train on what you input into it. And so as a regulator, you basically have to look over everyone's shoulder to get a sense of whether their rights have been respected or whether any harm has come from those models, right? You can't just have a full view the way you can with a lot of other.
I look at the EU AI Act or the more voluntary sort of executive approaches like what was happening in the US until recently. And they have a focus on the biggest models, or the ones that might get us towards artificial general intelligence. And I feel like there's this regulatory conundrum coming up where I think we're quite a long way from AGI, and that a lot of the action and the value and the profit is going to be in these more specialized, narrow-focused AI products. And then your point about the individualization, about everybody gets a different experience. The job of regulating all of this is so much harder than saying, okay, we're going to go look at the 5 biggest models.
It does underline the case for having more time between the creation of a new model and the release of a new model, because that way, at least, some lessons can be deducted from using or testing or, having a couple of people just using the model in the interest of understanding what might be the lessons learned there. But, the cutthroat competition that we see in the market now means actually the opposite, that a lot of companies are pushing aside safety concerns, are only too happy to just be faster than the competitor rather than taking on responsibility for any externalities or societal impact. And of course, that reminds us of the dynamics that we so often see, is that the benefits are for the companies. Look at their valuations, look at the investments that they're bringing on, but the harms are for society. So think about job displacement, think about people that are mistreated, think about more fraud or cybercrime because we're just using more software through the uptake of AI, and that exposes us to more risk. New opportunities through generative AI to mislead people, also for disinformation around, I don't know, elections or healthcare. So many challenges that ultimately impact us all. I mean, in many European cities, the vaccination grade is now not being met. I think it's the same for the United States. This has to do with disinformation about health. Well, who picks up the tab for that? Not the tech companies that are helping to spread lies around science, for example, but actually the public health system, which now has to deal with kids or others that are getting much more sick.
Yeah. And if we think about that price tag around lack of trust that develops around either a technology or the things that are spoken about on the technology, it makes me worry as well that a lot of people won't ever really begin to use or experiment AI. And if you don't understand AI and you don't use it, you're at risk of being left behind by it as well. Do you have any sort of advice or thoughts around how people can balance a concern for where the AI is headed while also still experimenting with it and making sure you aren't kind of the one who loses your job because of it?
Well, I don't know if people can really safeguard their jobs individually because I often see people, excited, mesmerized by what the AI can do, but not really looking at the collective consequences. So we often see the entertainment value comes first, but the collective impact is just not really gauged by people completely. And I also think that the entertainment value should not make people blindly trust the outcomes. We've seen so many examples of lies or added information coming out of generative AI where, for example, somebody draws a profile on themselves, let's say, and it's 90% correct. But then there's like 2 books referenced that the person never wrote or prizes that they allegedly won that they never got awarded. That's one thing to just be cautious about, is just that if you want to experiment with it, do not sort of blindly trust it or, take a big risk with your own credibility or your professional responsibilities. But even if you look at that more collectively, for example, we started our conversation looking at antitrust as a sort of key set of regulations that actually ensure fairness in the economy, which I think the staunchest capitalists will broadly agree with. Antitrust, for example, is going to be at stake when it comes to search through AI or generative AI, because where are the models pointing us? If they always point us to, well, let's take a fictive example, to Pepsi and not to Coca-Cola, well, Coca-Cola won't be happy, but how can it prove that the model is biased towards Pepsi? Or if it's always sending you into the direction of, I don't know, Taco Bell and not McDonald's, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Well, we covered a lot of serious stuff so far. If I could put aside, well, let's say reality for a second, so let's forget government and let's forget AI hallucinations for a second. If there were no limits, what would you task your AI sidekick with doing? What's your favorite way for using AI?
Well, I would love for an application to exist that can just be laser focused on what I should and should not spend time on, because I always struggle to, go through many invitations or requests that pop into my inbox. And then sometimes I find it hard to say no, or sometimes I find it hard to know exactly what to expect from different engagements. And I think, perhaps if there would be some magical application, they could sort of rate the priority of all the incoming requests and help me select, but also decline.
Oh, I would love that. And it could tell you, spend 22 minutes here. No, spend the full hour there. That would be fantastic.
Exactly. Yes.
Excellent. Well, Marietje, thank you so much for joining the AI Sidekick.
You're very welcome.
Now it's time to bring in 2 experts from Robin AI to run our hero hotline, where we answer your questions, your concerns, your challenges. Call it advice, call it food for thought, call it whatever you want. The idea here is to help you get the ROI you need from AI. In the Hero Hot Seat today, we've got Tremail Turner, who's the Chief Technology Officer at Robin AI, and Sabrina Pervez, who's Director of Alternative Assets and also founder of the Women in Legal AI Network. This one comes from Laura, and Laura wants to know, what is a credible approach to calculating time for human review of AI's work? She says her boss is looking at contract review tools, but is obsessed with the idea of getting a 90% time saving. And she thinks they might be forgetting that the team still needs to check the AI's work. And she wants your advice on how to level set with the boss.
Yeah, it's a great question from Laura, definitely. I think when it comes to the time savings that are possible, I think there are a few things someone should kind of have their mind to when working out time savings are actually possible at the outset. And the things I would recommend are, first of all, working out what your kind of pre-existing baseline of time spent is in the first instance. So how long is it taking your internal legal teams to review these contracts first, or how long is it taking external legal counsel to review those documents too? Then I would look at the potential time it takes for an AI tool to conduct that kind of first review markup of a document. And then I think where the time savings metric comes in is working out, how much time does it take you to just verify what the AI has done? So, for example, with Robin AI reports, we include hyperlinked citations as part of that checking verification process. And so quickly kind of clicking on each of those references is quite a short task. And so in total, the time savings are quite substantial when you look at the total time the exercise would have taken you without AI and what that kind of short checking process is at the end. But really, it kind of comes down to those three metrics at the outset to work out what the percentage could be, whether it's kind of 90% or otherwise.
Yeah, I deeply concur with what Sabrina said. And I think really when you think about creative work, and I do consider legal work creative work to some degree, or any work where you're having some level of human intuition and or advanced knowledge applied to the work at hand, it's always going to be difficult to ascertain what a sort of deterministic productivity score looks like. What you really want to do is sort of track the progress of improvement over time, basically what Sabrina was saying, to get a baseline and then look at different signals that give you an indication of whether or not that baseline is moving in a positive or negative direction. And so what does that mean practically? Typically, we want to be able to, one, understand what does a typical day in the life of a practitioner look like. And that's what Sabrina was speaking to towards the baseline. When we look at the technical system that's supporting that practitioner, or what we might call human in the loop or human augmentation, we want to see if there is correctness, and that correctness is sort of a vote of confidence that what we expect to have happen is actually happening as a result of, in this case, an AI enhanced or an LLM driven outcome. And we want to make sure that that level of augmentation is increasing productivity over time. Now, we claim, and we've seen in practice, that upwards of 40% plus productivity enhancement can be driven by virtue of having these augmented systems. What we don't claim and what we don't see, nor do we want to see, is that AI is completely replacing the human, because they simply can't. And that's the truth of the matter, that these LLMs, anything that you hear called quote unquote AI, is basically a technical system that's statistically processing a bunch of data and giving a fairly accurate result. But that accurate result still needs some level of, if you will, checking to make sure that it is exactly what you want, exactly what you need, and contextually appropriate for what you're delivering. And so tracking that over time is really the best way of helping to get Laura's boss the answer that he really needs. And that's whether or not we're being productive, whether or not we are actually accelerating the work, and whether or not we are enhancing our ability to get that work driven towards ultimately the goals that we all want to see.
And you never know, the AI might free up so much time or prompt you to think in another way that, it's not going to give you all of your time back, but it's going to give you a better result because it's forced you to think differently or helped you do your job differently. Okay. Thanks, Tremail. Thanks, Sabrina. Hope that's helpful, Laura.
Thanks for tuning into the AI Sidekick. I hope you're now feeling more confident about implementing AI into your business. If you found today's conversation valuable, be sure to subscribe and share it with your colleagues. For more insights or to see how Robin AI can help you make contracts simple, check out robinai.com. See you next time.